Good morning, everybody, and welcome. I'm Nick Goddard from the Australian Oilseeds Federation, and it's my absolute pleasure to be delivering the keynote address today at the Australian Brassica conference. And really the topic that I've thought I would expand upon is really this balance between food and fuel. So this debate's been going on for a couple of decades now. I thought I'd expand upon this and help shape perhaps a direction for the breeding program for rapeseed or canola into the future. So if we look at, what I'll do is really break this into three parts. I'll look at a bit of history, how we've got to this current situation. Then I'll look at the current situation, this challenge we have between food and fuel. And then we'll look at the future and what this really means for the Australian canola industry and what it might mean for breeders. So you're just going to have to bear with me while we toggle between screen and camera, but we will get through it. So I think many of you who are students of canola would know that it's been cultivated for centuries and centuries, millennia in fact, in China and Japan in biblical times. But some of the first documented history of actually the cultivation of rapeseed was in the 13th century, when rapeseed was being grown primarily for a stock feed. And here's a little picture from that time, and you can see here growers. There's John Kierkegaard on the right explaining to this grower how you can graze and grain at the same time, and you see the animals there. So it's something that graze and grain is something that's not new. It's been around now for something like seven or eight centuries, but it certainly provided that backbone for the rapeseed industry in these very early days. But just moving forward in terms of history, it brings us to the church had to get involved, of course, because churches just got involved in the Middle Ages, and the Catholic Church made a decree that for Lent you had to give up all the good things, and some of those good things were things like lard and olive oil and the like, and you had to suffer a little bit. It was it's that Catholic guilt thing. So it was decreed that you would actually need to start consuming lamp oil, and rapeseed was in fact one of the primary uses or sources for burning for light back around the 15th century. So we actually see with that the first use of rapeseed oil as a food, because it's already a fuel here being used for lighting, and then becomes used for food, although it being bitter and pretty unpalatable. That was all part of the whole Lent story. But as the Industrial Revolution got underway in the 19th century, we see rapeseed oil really starting to take off, and the cultivation throughout Europe, particularly throughout the United Kingdom, really starting to grow as steam-powered machines start to get moving and need lubrication. And they needed oil, they needed a lot of it, and rapeseed really started to find its home, I guess, and grow in cultivation. But when we get to modern day rapeseed, we've got this man to thank for it. Many of you would recognise this face instantly as sort of the father of the modern rapeseed, and certainly the oilseed complex that we're facing today. For those that don't know who it is, it's Rudolf Diesel. And Rudolf Diesel, German inventor in the 19th century, so the late 1800s, was tinkering with ways to improve the efficiency conversion between energy sources and the energy they produced. So steam was about 10% efficient at this time, so highly inefficient, I should say. And he cottoned onto the idea of developing an engine that would improve the efficiency, the conversion ratio of the feedstock to the energy that was delivered, and started to use vegetable oil as a source of that energy in a diesel engine. Now, he tinkered and developed a number of diesel engines, but really struggled, struggled terribly to try to get this idea adopted. And he became extremely depressed, which is pretty sad. the first public exhibition of some of his work was at the Paris Expo in 1900. And while it was a novelty, it didn't really gain the traction that it could have. And there were some technical issues of using just pure oil in a diesel. It did start to gum up the machine. And he became pretty depressed, and around about 1910, he mysteriously disappeared on a voyage to London. And it's strongly believed that he actually committed suicide on that voyage, being so depressed that his invention could not be adopted. And it was only until the emergence of World War I and the need for more mobility that the diesel engine started to actually gain some more traction. And so to the use of diesel as an accepted form of internal combustion. And of course, by this time, mineral oil was becoming quite abundant, and the internal combustion engine fueled by petrol, and then mineral oil diesel became the norm. But he did have some foresight, because at the Paris Expo in 1900, he is claimed to have made this comment, and that being that the fact that fat oils from vegetable sources can be used may seem insignificant today in 1900, but such oils may perhaps become, in the course of time, of the same importance as some natural mineral oils and the tar products are now. So that's pretty much where we are today. What we currently use as a feedstock for biodiesel is the methyl ester of oil, vegetable oils, and this wasn't really developed until the 1930s, and the rest is pretty much history. But there we see rapeseed being used in industrial purposes for a long time, and it wasn't, as we all know, until the Canadians in the 1970s started to tinker with it and develop low erucic acid rapeseed, and of course we all know the rest of the story after that. And it became then a food. But it was the Europeans, once again, this time in around 2003, they issued a directive to promote the use of biofuels, just broadly biofuels. And what that did, it really led to a resurgence, or return almost, of rapeseed as a rotation crop in the European agriculture, having declined since the Industrial Revolution. So we see a great expansion of rapeseed in Europe, but at the same time, we start to see this food versus fuel debate starting to get some traction. Again, not only with vegetable oils, but crops like corn with ethanol, sugarcane with ethanol, even wheat with ethanol. This whole debate during those early parts of this century, in the 2000s, became quite an active debate around good agricultural land being used to produce fuel rather than food. And that pretty much brings us to the current day where we sit today, and the situation we find ourselves in. So if we look at the global biodiesel market today, we'll see that, let's just get this technology right here. Okay, so the global feedstock for biodiesel, we see that rapeseed is about relatively modest at about 14%. We see a large proportion devoted to palm oil. This is predominantly in Indonesia and Malaysia, where biodiesel is a very large proportion of the total diesel usage. Interestingly enough, and take note of the used cooking oil at 10% and tallow at 6%. Come back to those. But that's the current global situation. If we look at the European situation, and this is obviously what drives the Australian market, given that the majority of our canola is exported to Europe for biodiesel, they're looking at 38% of their feedstock coming from rapeseed, and also a large proportion coming from used cooking oil. And this is what's really driving the European biodiesel market. And what happened since the 2003 European directive was another directive in 2008 that setting specific targets for the incorporation of renewable into their fuel components, and that obviously is what drives the European use of vegetable oils as a feedstock. But there are some limits to this, because you look at something like used cooking oil. Well, there's not going to be a lot more used cooking oil available. It's growing relatively slowly, certainly much slower than the demand for biodiesel. And similarly, tallow, the slaughter rates are not keeping, animal slaughter rates are not keeping up with the demand for biodiesel. So that's putting a lot of pressure, a great deal of pressure on agricultural crops to deliver that. However, that, when we look at that, the opportunity for agricultural crops to deliver this, that is the challenge, because if we look at the European rapeseed market, and many of you will be familiar with this, it used to be around 20 to 22 million tonnes per annum, but now they're struggling to get 16 and 17 million tonnes per annum. So a significant drop in a relatively short period of time. Yeah, they've had some really harsh summers, terrible summers, and this is just another one just gone, which has really impacted the ability to produce. But the ban on some of the chemicals, particularly the neonics, has really impacted their ability to manage insect and pests. And also the lack of access to genetic breeding techniques has really also hampered their ability to progress and improve and increase their yields. So it's flattening. Similarly, soybeans globally, after decades of very strong yield growth, are now starting to see the yield starting to plateau off. And again, if we look at palm oil, so the largest single contributor to biodiesel feedstock, again, palm oil is slowing down. The yields are pretty much flatlining for palm oil. And of course, there is the social/environmental pressure around palm oil as well. So if you look at that, given that the major accelerating driver behind vegetable oils generally, but including that rapeseed and canola, is biodiesel, then there's a constraint there because of the ability today of those crops to actually increase their yields. Now that's on one hand. On the other hand, and I'm going to now focus on the United States, because while some of these European directives were issued 2003 and 2008, the US situation is far more recent, and we're able to get some much more solid data around the changes for that. So if we look at the US low carbon fuel standard, that was first introduced by California, and it's since been adopted by 7 other states in the US, and it's rapidly gaining attention in the other states. And similarly, as we speak, the Canadian government is debating a low carbon fuel standard to be adopted nationally across Canada. And that's creating a lot of demand and a lot of interest. So if we take that just a step further and have a look at some of the developments that are going on around that, we'll see the demand for refining capacity growing very, very strongly. So this is the US biodiesel refinery capacity was pretty modest at around 100 million gallons. It's very hard for us to conceptualize a million gallons, but this is just the US terms. About, maybe 100 million gallons a year. Around 2018 started to lift up. But really by the time Biden stepped into the White House, and the confidence that delivered, particularly around renewables, given that's part of Biden's policy, led to an explosive growth in commitments for refining capacity to be constructed. So this is what's basically on the cards today in 2021 in terms of what's going to be delivered in the future. So if you're a renewable fuel advocate and you want to see more renewable fuel, you'd look at that and think that is absolutely fantastic. Look at that growth in renewable fuels. The challenge is when you get to the later this decade in 2030, there is a very large shortfall of the ability of the United States to produce enough vegetable oil to meet the demand. Something like a 16 to 18 million tonne shortfall of vegetable oil, and that pretty much then brings us to the future, the final part of this talk, and how are we going to cope with this future. So, there are a number of factors that I wanted to raise that are really going to impact the ability of biodiesel to remain a strong driver for the vegetable oil complex and the role that it plays for rapeseed and canola, specifically for us in Australia. Now, one of the issues I just alluded to was, okay, the US has got all these fantastic aspirations and they're policy driven. How are they going to deliver them? Well, maybe it's just as simple as getting some more acres. And if we look now at the additional acres that are actually needed to meet the US veg oil deficit for biodiesel, these are the incremental acres that are needed. And if we look at this for soybean oil, we're talking about something like, 50 to 60 million additional acres. And for canola oil, we're looking at something like, 30 odd million acres additional. So that you add those two together and that's what's needed in total. And I think, that's something like a 60% increase in soybeans, and it's more than double. So soybeans at the moment in the United States, I think they currently farm about 88 million hectares. They need to add another 50 odd to that. And similarly with canola, including Canada, looking at something like, 24 million acres, or I should say acres, across North America, and they'll need to add an additional 30 million acres. Now, where's that going to come from? Okay, well, it can't very well come from corn, which the corn's a large crop in the United States. Can't really impinge too much on that because corn's a major source of, well, certainly high fructose corn syrup, but in terms of where we're talking, in terms of ethanol, it's a major supplier of ethanol. So if we're looking to improve our renewable energy, we can't eat into corn, can't eat into sugarcane too much for the same reason. So there aren't too many other crops really left. And given the narrower seasons they have in the United States, what this starts to do is start to impinge on the wheat production. So the projections are that wheat production will be giving way to more oilseed and or biofuel feedstock production across ethanol, across corn rather, soy and canola. Now, that sounds crazy, but it's got to the point where the flour manufacturers in the United States are actually getting quite worried, significantly worried about their ability to be able to meet the domestic demand for flour by losing acres to the oilseed crop. So there's just not enough arable land in America to both feed them and fuel them. And that, I think, is where we're going to start to see this tension between food and fuel really come back to the surface again. It was quite strong sort of 10, 15 years ago. The climate change debate has, I think, then taken that headspace, and now COVID has taken that headspace, but I think we'll see sooner than later the whole food versus fuel debate starting to re-emerge, particularly as prices at the supermarket shelf start to rise and people start to feel that pinch. So that's the first thing that I think is a threat for biodiesel, looking into the future. The second one is the commitment by the large car manufacturers to move to electric vehicles. I mean, both Volvo and Mercedes-Benz have said that by 2030, they will be out of internal combustion engines and they'll be looking at electric vehicles. So the demand for biodiesel will start to drop back. In fact, they're saying that the projections are that by 2025, 20% of all new car sales will be electric vehicles. And the same source is saying 40% by 2040. So by 2040, 40% of all new vehicle sales will be electric vehicles. Now, that's probably a conservative estimate. If you look at the rate of change, if we look 5 years ago, you might have said, yeah, you might have seen the odd Prius driving around, but not much more than that. Now, seeing Teslas driving around is not uncommon, and the rate of change and adoption of electric vehicles will only accelerate, no pun intended there, but will only continue to grow as technology improves and brings the cost down. So we'll see that the demand for diesel and for biofuels for motor vehicles will drop significantly, and that includes heavy vehicles as well. So the likes of Volvo and Mercedes have already made those similar commitments to their heavy vehicle fleets, which are obviously huge consumers of diesel. And the third aspect, which I think is critically important, is basic human physiology. Now, a little bit of back of envelope maths. The human body needs about roughly 8,000 kilojoules a day to get by. Now, around a third, a little under a third, maybe 28% of energy needs to come from fats and oils. So if we sort of do the maths, and at 70 grams a day, that works out at about 70 grams a day. If we multiply that across the year, across the population at the moment of something like 7.5 billion people, the planet needs around 200 million tons of fat to be consumed by human beings just to have a balanced metabolism. Now, that doesn't all come from vegetable oils. I mean, obviously there's fat in fish, there's fat in meat, small amounts of fat in some nuts and seeds. But by far the major source of that is vegetable oils. In fact, 75% of the dietary fat in the global population diet is coming from vegetable oils. And that's looking to grow significantly, much faster than population growth. So current projections are around 13% growth for vegetable oils for human consumption. So, we've got a number of factors there that are weighing against biodiesel and in fact weighing in favour of vegetable oils for food. And the part that we haven't really touched a lot on is the whole protein equation. You'd all be very well aware of the growing demand for plant food as protein, plant-based proteins. And obviously soybeans played a key role in that over the last 10, 15 years, but particularly over the last sort of 3 years, the role of soy protein in meeting those growing demands for plant-based proteins, the meat substitutes, etc. But increasing investment and strong investment behind canola meal is also going on, particularly in Canada, but I'm also aware of the work that's being done in the CSIRO to really explore and identify opportunities to, I guess, fractionate canola meal to make use of that meal for human protein sources. And some of you might be aware that the Food Standards Australia and New Zealand recently approved a canola meal protein sort of fraction as a acceptable food or permitted food in Australian food supply. So it's there. That's an imported product, fortunately, but it can be made locally. We're starting to see the emergence of canola meal protein or canola plant protein in the human diet presents a tremendous opportunity for us all. So I guess in summing up, if we look at the balance of what's going on in the world, there are some pros and cons for it all. So weighing heavily against fuel, and even though it's weighing heavily, it's pushing the scales up. I couldn't quite get this picture to work for me, but you get the concept, I think, is that the drivers for fuel are actually decreasing. So we've got social pressure, the whole social pressure, the food versus fuel debate. You've got production pressure. There just is not enough land to produce the biodiesel that various countries have put into place for mandates. That's going to create price pressures, which will be intolerable, in a very low inflation environment. If food is one of the first things that starts to rise, I think that will be politically uncomfortable for most governments. And then, of course, the emergence of electric vehicles. Who's going to need biodiesel in 20 or 30 years' time? So on the plus side, and weighing down in a positive way, for food are other items I've just discussed, the protein demand, particularly on the human side. Now, we have strong protein demand for animals, and we know that the majority of soybeans are grown for soy meal, for animal feed, and strong role for canola meal in animal feed as well. But added to that is the role in human feed for plant proteins. And then the second aspect is human physiology, just that need to absorb essential fatty acids only available through vegetable oils. So I think we will see the this shift start to happen over the course of the next decade and a half, which is sort of almost the breeding cycle if we want to start that. And we're certainly aware, and I think some of you would be aware of the work that's going on amongst some of the global seed companies, and also in Australia now, to shift that balance between protein and oil in canola breeding. You know, to date, we've basically been chasing the money, and we've been chasing the oil because that's what growers get paid on. But we're starting to see now growing interest in the protein side of it to get better value for meal for stock feed. I guess that's the first driver. But secondly, to look at opportunities to optimize the amino acid profile for human consumption. So I guess the message I would probably like to leave with you is the debate about food versus fuel is going to be with us for a little while. But I think as long-term thinkers and breeders, we need to think a little bit more, not so much food versus fuel, but food in brackets oil versus food in brackets protein when it comes to canola breeding. So that's really what I wanted to cover today. Thanks for your time. I look forward to joining the rest of the conference over the next 2 days. Some papers that on the agenda that are certainly way above my head, but I look forward to tuning in throughout the course of the next 2 days. And good luck with the conference. Thanks very much. Bye.